The air in the Silver Creek Bank tasted of stale paper and floor polish, a scent of placid commerce shattered in an instant. Gunsmoke, acrid and sharp, clawed at Sheriff Isaac Blackwood's throat. A chandelier, its crystals now a spiderweb of cracks, swung wildly, casting drunken beams of light across the chaos. Overturned tables and scattered banknotes formed a barricade for the terrified clerk, but the masked rider ignored the money. His attention was singular, his voice a low rasp that cut through the screams. The box, number 37. Isaac crouched behind a heavy oak desk, felt the burn in his shoulder where a stray bullet had grazed him. The pain was a distant drumbeat against the thunder of his heart. He raised his Colt, the hammer clicking back with a sound that felt both deafening and inadequate. "It's over," he yelled, his voice rough. "There's no way out of here." The rider, a tall man clad in black from his dusty boots to the bandana obscuring his face, laughed. It was a hollow, unsettling sound. "I'm not leaving without it." He gestured with his pistol toward the vault which the frantic manager was fumbling to open. "Hurry it up." Isaac saw his opening. The rider was distracted, his focus on the vault door. He rose, firing once, twice. The first shot splintered the doorframe beside the rider's head. The second caught him in the arm, spinning him around with a curse of pain. But the man was fast. He returned fire, a wild shot that sent Isaac stumbling back. The world tilted, a searing fire erupting in his left leg. He hit the floor hard, his gun skittering away across the polished wood. The vault door swung open. The rider, clutching his bleeding arm, shoved the manager inside. Moments later, he emerged with a small metal safety deposit box. He didn't bother to open it. He simply tucked it into his saddlebag, his eyes cold and dark over the bandana, finding Isaac on the floor. "This is just the beginning." Sheriff the rider rasped, his voice laced with a venom that felt deeply personal. He backed toward the door, his pistol still trained on the room, and vanished into the street. The sound of galloping hooves faded, leaving behind a ringing silence, broken only by the whimpers of the clerk. Isaac gritted his teeth, pushing himself up on one elbow. His leg was a ruin of pain, blood soaking through his trousers. He was a lawman, the protector of this town, and he had failed. As the town doctor rushed in, Isaac's last conscious thought was not of the money or the robbery, but of the chilling promise in the rider's voice. A beginning. A beginning of what? The noon train arrived an hour later, its whistle a mournful cry that seemed to carry the town's newfound fear. Malene Cooper stepped onto the platform and into a world simmering with tension. Men stood in tight, anxious knots, their voices low and urgent. Women hurried past, clutching their children's hands. The air, thick with red dust, also carried a palpable sense of unease. This was not the hopeful new start her father's letters had promised. Dressed in a modest but well-made traveling suit from Boston, Malene felt conspicuously out of place. Her worn leather valise, clutched tightly in one hand, held everything she owned in the world. She scanned the platform for her father, a man she hadn't seen in a decade, but found only the strained faces of strangers. A telegram she'd received at the last stop had already warned her this might be a fool's errand. "Your plans have changed." It read, a cruel and dismissive postscript to years of broken promises. "Do not come." But the ticket was bought, her life in Boston packed away. There was nowhere else to go. A deputy, his face young and shadowed with worry, approached her. "Mom, are you Miss Cooper?" "I am," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The sheriff asked me to meet you. He's indisposed, if you'll follow me." The word indisposed did little to prepare her for the scene at the sheriff's office. The small building smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Isaac Blackwood sat in a chair behind his desk, his left leg propped on a stool swathed in thick bandages. Another dressing was visible on his shoulder, and his face etched with lines of pain and exhaustion, was pale beneath a sun-bronzed complexion. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes, a startling shade of blue, held a weary resolve that she found both intimidating and compelling. "Miss Cooper," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Isaac Blackwood. Apologies for the poor welcome. Silver Creek's had a difficult morning. I heard talk of a robbery." Malene said, her gaze drawn to his injuries. Are you all right, Sheriff?" A faint smile touched his lips, a flicker of light in the grimness of his expression. "I'll mend. The town's pride, however, might take a little longer. Please have a seat." He gestured to a wooden chair opposite his desk. She sat, placing her valise at her feet. The silence stretched thick with unspoken questions. "Your father's telegram arrived yesterday." Isaac began, his voice gentle but direct. "He said you were coming to join him." Malene's hands tightened in her lap. "I received a more recent communication from him. It seems his circumstances have changed. He has remarried. I am no longer welcome." She delivered the words with a practiced calm, a shield against the humiliation that burned beneath. Isaac's expression softened with something that looked like genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that. That's a hard thing to face alone." He studied her for a moment. "Your mother was Sarah, wasn't she, Sarah Cooper?" The mention of her mother's name was a shock. "Yes, you knew her, only by reputation. She owned the old Double C ranch just east of town. I remember her. A strong woman, had a spirit as wild as the country she was trying to tame." He paused, his gaze distant. "The whole town was sorry when we heard she'd passed back east." This was news to Malene. Her father had always described her mother's life here as a brief, unhappy chapter before she fled back to the civilization of Boston. "She owned a ranch." "She did. Left it to you according to the county records. It's been sitting empty for years, but the land is yours. Title's clear." The information landed with the force of a physical blow. A ranch. A piece of this land that was hers. It wasn't the life with her father she had been promised, but it was something tangible. A legacy. A reason to stay. "I had no idea," she whispered. "Perhaps that's why you're here then," Isaac said. "Not for a broken promise, but for a legacy you didn't know you had." Before Malene could process this, the office door swung open and a man entered, removing a fine felt hat. He was handsome in a severe way, with dark, watchful eyes and a suit too clean for the dusty streets of Silver Creek. He nodded politely to Malene before turning his attention to the sheriff. "Sheriff Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I came to express my condolences on this morning's unfortunate events, and to offer any assistance I might provide." "That's good of you, Mr. Thorne," Isaac replied, his tone hardening almost imperceptibly. "But we have it under control." "Of course." The man Thorne turned his gaze to Malene, a charming smile gracing his lips. It did not reach his eyes. "Silas Thorne," he said, extending a hand. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "Malene Cooper," she said, accepting his handshake. His grip was firm, his hand surprisingly cool. Cooper Thorne's eyes sharpened with interest. "Any relation to Sarah Cooper, who used to own the old Double C?" "She was my mother." Thorne's smile widened. "A remarkable coincidence. I've been making inquiries about that very property. It's a fine piece of land, Miss Cooper, though terribly neglected. I would be prepared to make you a generous offer for it. It would save you the trouble of managing a place that has fallen into such disrepair." "I've only just learned the ranch is mine," Malene said, pulling her hand from his. "I'm not prepared to discuss selling it." "Naturally." Thorne's politeness was a veneer over something cold and insistent. "But think on it. This is a harsh country for a woman alone." He glanced at Isaac's bandaged leg. "As you can see, it can be harsh, even for those meant to protect us." With another nod to the sheriff, Thorne departed, leaving a chill in the room that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Be wary of that one," Isaac said quietly, his eyes on the door through which Thorne had vanished. "He's been buying up land all over the valley. Seems to have a special interest in your mother's property." Malene looked from the sheriff's weary, honest face to the street outside, where the dust of Thorne's passage was settling. She had arrived in Silver Creek, feeling abandoned and adrift. Now, in the space of an hour, she had a home, a legacy, and it seemed an enemy. The fear that had gripped her on the train platform was slowly being replaced by a different emotion, something harder and more resolute. She would not be scared away. She would see this ranch, her mother's ranch, and she would decide her own future. The Double C Ranch was less a home than a ghost. It sat in a shallow basin 2 miles from town, a small, dusty, clapboard house and a dilapidated barn tilting against the relentless blue sky. The wind whistling through broken window panes carried the scent of dust and distant sage. Weeds choked the yard where her mother's garden might have been. It was a place of profound neglect, yet as Malene stood before it, she felt a powerful, inexplicable connection. This was hers. Isaac had insisted on driving her out in his wagon, arguing that his leg was less of a hindrance than her ignorance of the territory. He stood beside her now, leaning on a makeshift crutch, his face grim as he surveyed the decay. "It's seen better days," he said, his voice an understatement. "It must have." Malene murmured, her gaze fixed on the house. She could almost imagine a woman, her mother, standing on that porch, looking out at this same unforgiving landscape. They forced the front door open with a groan of protest. Inside, the air was thick and stale. A layer of fine red powder coated every surface. Furniture, simple and handmade, was draped in dusty canvas sheets, spectral shapes in the dim light. It was a time capsule of a life abandoned. "Looks like it was left in a hurry," Isaac observed, nudging a canvas sheet with his crutch to reveal a sturdy wooden table. As Malene moved through the small rooms, a sense of violation began to creep over her. A drawer in the bedroom was pulled out, its contents spilled. The floorboards near the hearth had been pried up and hastily replaced. This wasn't just neglect. Someone had been here. Someone had been searching for something. "Isaac," she called, her voice tight with alarm. He hobbled in from the main room. "What is it? Look." She pointed to the disturbed floorboards and the scattered remnants of what looked like old letters. "It's been ransacked." Isaac's jaw tightened. He knelt with difficulty, examining the floor. "Recently. And they weren't looking for money." His eyes met hers, the same grim understanding passing between them. Thorne. The name hung in the air. His inquiries about the property suddenly seemed far more sinister. But what could he possibly be looking for? Her answer lay in a small, cedar-lined chest at the foot of the bed. It too had been forced open, its lock broken. Most of its contents, faded linens and dried flowers, had been tossed aside. But in her frantic search through the mess, Malene noticed one item was conspicuously absent. Tucked into a corner of the now empty chest was a small embossed leather bookmark. On it, in faded gold leaf, were the words, "From the Journal of Sarah Cooper." The journal itself was gone. "He took my mother's journal," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and violation. The book held her mother's thoughts, her history in this place. It was an intimacy stolen by a stranger. "He's not just after the land," Malene, Isaac said softly, using her first name for the first time. "He's after something your mother knew, something she wrote down." Standing in the ruins of her inheritance, holding the only remaining piece of her mother's stolen past, Malene felt her last tie to her old life snap. The timid, disappointed woman who had stepped off the train that morning was gone. In her place was someone else, a woman with a purpose. She would not sell. She would not run. She would stay, she would rebuild this ranch, and she would find out what secret Silas Thorne was so desperate to keep buried. He won't get this land, she said, her voice low and fierce. She looked at Isaac, her resolve hardening into a vow. And I will get her journal back. Isaac looked at her, at the fire that had ignited in her eyes, and for the first time since the robbery, a genuine smile touched his lips. I believe you will, he said. And I'll help you. The first days at the Double C were a trial by fire. Malene, accustomed to the curated comforts of Boston, found herself battling a world of dust, rust, and decay. Every task was a lesson in humility. Mending a fence left her hands raw and bleeding. Clearing the yard of tumbleweeds and thorns was an endless backbreaking chore. The silence of the nights, punctuated by the cry of coyotes, felt vast and lonely. She wasn't entirely alone. The day after she moved her meager belongings into the one habitable room of the ranch house, an old man appeared at her door, riding a mule as grizzled as he was. He had a weathered face, a fringe of white hair beneath a stained hat, and eyes that held a lifetime of sun-squinting wisdom. "You Sarah's girl?" he asked without preamble, his voice like gravel rolling downhill. "I am Malene Cooper, Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Worked for your mother. Best woman I ever knew. Heard you were aiming to fix this place up. I am. Can't do it alone," he stated flatly. "This land needs more than one pair of hands, especially city hands. I'll work for room and board and whatever else you can spare. Your mother was good to me. I aim to pay that back to her blood." Jed became her teacher and her anchor. He showed her how to patch the roof, how to prime the stubborn well pump, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. His dialogue was earthy and direct, filled with frontier wisdom. "Land ain't something you own, missy," he'd say, as they repaired a corral. "It's something you come to an agreement with. You respect it, it provides. You fight it, it breaks you." He spoke of her mother, with a quiet reverence that painted a picture of a woman Malene had never known, resilient, kind, and deeply connected to this harsh, beautiful place. Isaac visited as often as his duties and his healing leg would allow, arriving in his wagon with supplies from town, a sack of flour, a new axe head, news of the outside world. He never spoke of charity, framing the offerings as neighborly assistance. He'd sit on the porch, his leg propped up, and watch as Jed instructed Malene on the proper way to handle a rifle. His expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "You're a fast learner," he commented one afternoon, after she'd managed to hit a tin can from 20 paces. "Necessity is a demanding teacher," Malene replied, wiping a sheen of sweat from her brow. Her language was still formal, a remnant of Boston, but a new directness was creeping in. The West was stripping away her non-essentials in speech as in life. The threats from Silas Thorne were not long in coming. They began subtly, a section of newly mended fence cut during the night. The well mysteriously fouled with a dead animal. Jed found tracks of 2 riders near the property line after each incident. "Thorne's men," Jed grunted, his eyes dark with anger. "Trying to scare you off." "It will take more than this," Malene said, her jaw set. Then the intimidation escalated. 2 hard-faced men rode up to the ranch one afternoon while Jed was in town. They cornered Malene by the barn, their presence alone a physical threat. "Mr. Thorne sent us to repeat his offer," the leader said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "He's a patient man, but his patience is wearing thin. This ain't no place for a lady." "I am precisely where I belong," Malene retorted, her hand tightening on the handle of the axe she'd been using to chop firewood. "That can be changed," the man said with a smirk. A voice cut through the tension, sharp and cold as a winter wind. "I believe the lady asked you to leave her property." Isaac stood 20 feet away, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He had approached silently, his limp barely noticeable. His sheriff's badge glinted in the afternoon sun. The men's bravado evaporated. They exchanged a nervous glance, mounted their horses, and rode off without another word. Isaac walked over to her, his eyes scanning her for any sign of harm. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her heart was pounding. "Thank you. My job is to protect the people of this county." He said, his voice concise, and measured the words of a man who didn't waste them. But his eyes told a different story, one of personal concern that went far beyond duty. "But I can't be here every minute. You need to be careful." His gruff exterior cracked for a moment. "I don't want to see you hurt, Malene." The quiet intensity of his words hung in the air between them. It was in these moments of shared danger and quiet support that a bond was forming, forged in the dust and sun of the Double C. Malene was fighting for her mother's legacy, but she was no longer fighting alone. The search for answers became a quiet obsession, a current running beneath the daily struggle of ranch life. While Isaac pursued the official investigation into the bank robbery in town, Malene searched for her own clues at the Double C. She sifted through the scattered letters and papers Thorne's men had overlooked, piecing together fragments of her mother's life. Most were simple accounts and records, but one small leather-bound ledger contained detailed notes on local geology. Her mother, it seemed, had been a keen observer of the land. Malene found sketches of rock formations and streams with notations about water levels and soil composition. One section was dedicated entirely to the land at the northern edge of her property, the very land that bordered Silas Thorne's sprawling cattle empire. Her mother had written, "Something is wrong with the water here. Tastes of bitter almond. Cattle avoid it. Thorne's cattle." Meanwhile, Isaac's investigation was hitting a wall. The masked rider had vanished without a trace. No one recognized the description. But the single-minded nature of the crime, the demand for one specific safety deposit box, haunted him. The box had been registered to a woman named Eleanor Thorne, Silas Thorne's late wife. "She died 5 years ago," Isaac told Malene one evening as they sat on her porch, the setting sun painting the mesas in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. "During the fever outbreak. Same one that took my Elizabeth and Sarah." A shadow passed over his face, a familiar grief that Malene was beginning to recognize. "What was in the box?" Malene asked gently. "According to the bank manager, Thorne cleared it out himself after his wife died. All but one item he claimed he couldn't find: a silver locket. He seemed to think it was just a sentimental trinket. Now 5 years later, someone is willing to rob a bank and shoot a sheriff just to get it. A locket," Malene mused. "Why would that be so important? That's the question I can't answer." Their investigations separate until now began to converge. A few days later, Malene was clearing out a dusty corner of the barn when she found an old, forgotten trunk. Inside, beneath a stack of her mother's plain practical dresses, was a small rosewood box. It was locked. Jed, with his knack for all things mechanical, managed to pick the simple lock. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a photograph. It showed 2 young women, their arms linked, smiling for the camera. One was undeniably her mother Sarah, younger than Malene had ever seen her. The other woman was a stranger, with dark, intense eyes and a smile that held a hint of sadness. On the back of the photograph, in her mother's elegant script, were 2 names, Sarah and Eleanor. Sisters forever. Eleanor Thorne. The name hit Malene with the force of a physical impact. She stared at the photograph, the world shifting around her. Her mother and Silas Thorne's late wife were sisters. This wasn't a land dispute. It was a dark, twisted family drama rooted in a past she had never known. She showed the photograph to Isaac that evening. He stared at it for a long time, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "Your mother and Thorne's wife were sisters," he said, his voice low with the weight of the revelation. "Which makes you Thorne's niece by marriage. And it means Thorne is lying." Malene said, her mind racing. "He pretended not to know who I was. He's not just after the land. He's trying to erase my mother, erase her entire connection to this place. Why? Thorne's aggression escalated. He filed a legal challenge to her mother's title, claiming an old debt gave him rights to the land. The intimidation became more overt. Riders patrolled the borders of the Double C, a constant menacing presence. The town, already nervous since the robbery, began to treat Malene with a wary distance, afraid to be caught in the crossfire of Thorne's ambition. But Malene refused to be cowed. With Jed's help, she and Isaac found the canceled check proving her mother had repaid the supposed debt years ago. They presented the evidence to the circuit judge, who threw out Thorne's claim. It was a small victory, but it came at a cost. Thorne's polite facade was gone, replaced by a cold, open hostility. The conflict had become deeply personal, a battle not just for land, but for the truth of her family's past. And as she and Isaac worked together, sharing clues and offering support, their connection deepened. The quiet respect had blossomed into a shared affection, an unspoken tenderness that was as vital to her as the water from the well. They were partners in this fight, and she was beginning to hope in whatever came after. The breaking point came on a blistering afternoon. Malene returned from a ride along the property line to find the ranch house eerily quiet. Jed, who was supposed to be repairing a harness by the barn, was nowhere to be seen. His tools lay scattered in the dust. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, pierced the afternoon heat. On the front door of the house, a piece of paper was pinned with a knife. The message was stark and brutal. "We have your man. The land and the photograph for his life. Come to the old North Star mine at sundown. Come alone." Malene's blood ran cold. They had Jed. Thorne had crossed a line from intimidation to outright violence, making the threat direct and personal. She ran into the house, her first instinct to grab the rifle. But then she stopped. Thorne had said to come alone. It was a trap, and walking into it with a gun was suicide. Her mind raced, searching for another option, another way. She saddled her horse, her movements frantic. She had to tell Isaac. He would know what to do. As she galloped toward town, the red sand glowing like embers under a merciless sun, she felt a terrifying clarity. This was no longer just about her mother's legacy or a family secret. This was a fight for the life of a man who had become her friend, her protector. And it was a test of the man who was quickly becoming the center of her world. When Malene burst into his office, Isaac took one look at her face and rose to his feet, his limp all but forgotten. She handed him the note, her hand trembling. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury as he read it. He's gone too far. He strapped on his gun belt, his movements swift and economical. I'll handle this. No, Malene said, her voice firm. The note says I am to come alone. If he sees you, he'll kill Jed. And if you go alone, he'll kill you both. Isaac countered, his voice a low growl of protective anger. This is my duty, Malene. As sheriff. And Jed is my friend, she shot back. He was taken from my ranch because of me. This is my responsibility. Their eyes locked in a battle of wills. For Isaac, this was a professional crisis that had become intensely personal. His duty to the town was now inextricably linked with his need to protect the woman he was coming to love. For Malene, it was the ultimate test of the strength she had discovered within herself. We do this together, Isaac said finally, his tone brokering no argument. But we do it my way. He wants you at the North Star mine. He'll be expecting you to come up the main trail from the south. We'll use that to our advantage. The North Star mine was a scar on the landscape, a relic of a silver boom that had long since busted. Its main entrance gaped like a dark mouth in the side of a desolate mesa, its structures collapsing into ruin. As Malene and Isaac approached from the north, riding low through a series of arroyos, the sky began to bleed from blue to a bruised, angry orange. A rising wind whipped sand into their faces, stinging their eyes and moaning through the rocks. A sandstorm was brewing. He chose this place for a reason. Isaac said, his voice barely audible over the wind. It's isolated. The storm will cover his tracks. They left the horses in a sheltered ravine and proceeded on foot, the wind tearing at their clothes. Isaac outlined the plan in sharp, concise sentences. Malene would approach the mine entrance, as instructed, a decoy to draw Thorne's attention. Isaac would circle around to a ventilation shaft he knew of higher up the mesa, giving him a way into the mine's upper tunnels and a surprise vantage point. When you see Thorne, keep him talking, Isaac instructed, his hands gripping her shoulders. His blue eyes were intense, filled with a desperate urgency. Find out where Jed is. I'll handle the rest. Do you understand? I understand, she said, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Malene. He hesitated, the gruff lawman struggling with the man beneath. Be careful. He leaned in and pressed a hard, brief kiss to her lips, a promise and a prayer in one. Then he was gone, melting into the growing twilight and the swirling sand. Malene took a deep breath, clutching the small parcel containing the photograph, and walked toward the dark maw of the mine. The howl of the wind was a symphony of desolation. Inside, the entrance lanterns cast flickering, monstrous shadows against the damp rock walls. Silas Thorne stood waiting, his handsome face a mask of triumphant malice. Two of his men stood behind him, rifles held ready. Jed was nowhere in sight. Miss Cooper Thorne said, his voice a chilling, eloquent purr. Punctual. I do admire that in a woman. Do you have what I asked for? Where is Jed? Malene demanded, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. He is secured, Thorne replied evasively. First the photograph, and the deed to the ranch signed over to me. The deed is not part of our agreement. Malene said, stalling for time, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of Isaac. Thorne laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Don't play games with me, girl. You are in no position to bargain. He stepped closer, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that went far beyond greed. You have no idea what this is truly about, do you? You think this is about land-water rights. He snatched the photograph from her hand. This is about justice. For her. He gestured with the photo toward the darkness of the mine. For my Eleanor. She was my mother's sister, Malene said, her voice shaking slightly. I know that much. And your mother helped destroy her. Thorne's voice cracked the veneer of control, shattering to reveal the raw grief beneath. They were all in it together. Your mother, the doctor, and him. Your precious Sheriff Blackwood. From the shadows above them, a piece of loose gravel clattered down. Thorne's men jerked their rifles up, but Thorne waved them down too, consumed by his own rage to notice. What does Isaac have to do with this? Malene asked, her heart pounding. He let them die, Thorne roared, his face contorted. The fever came, and there wasn't enough medicine. Blackwood was in charge of the town's supplies. He had a choice: save his wife and child or save mine. And he chose his own. He withheld the medicine. He sat in his office and signed my family's death warrant so that his could live. The accusation was monstrous, unthinkable. Malene stared at him, speechless. It's a lie, Thorne. A voice boomed from the darkness above. Isaac stepped into the lantern light on a high ledge, his shotgun leveled. And your vendetta ends tonight. Thorne spun around his face, a mask of pure hatred. Blackwood, I knew you wouldn't have the courage to stay away. His men raised their rifles, but Isaac was faster. He fired the shotgun, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. The shot wasn't aimed at the men, but at a cluster of rotting support beams above them. The ceiling groaned. Rock and splintered wood rained down, forcing Thorne's men to scramble for cover and separating them from their boss. It's over, Silas Isaac said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that transcended the conflict. You've been chasing a ghost. You murdered them, Thorne screamed, pulling his own pistol. No. A new voice cut through the chaos. Malene turned to see Jed, his face bruised, but resolute, being shoved forward by another of Thorne's men from a side tunnel. The man held a knife to Jed's throat. Drop the gun, Sheriff, the man snarled, or the old man dies. Isaac froze his face, a torment of indecision. Thorne smiled a terrible, triumphant expression. It seems we have a stalemate. But this time, Sheriff, you will not get to choose who lives and who dies. As Thorne raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Isaac's heart, Malene acted. She still had the heavy, leather-bound geological ledger from her mother's trunk tucked into her satchel. With a scream of rage, she swung the satchel with all her might, catching Thorne's gun arm. The pistol discharged, the bullet ricocheting wildly off the rock wall. In that same instant, Isaac made his choice. He dropped his shotgun and drew his Colt, firing not at Thorne, but at the man holding Jed. The shot was perfect. The man crumpled, releasing his hold. Jed stumbled forward, safe. The mine shuddered, a deep groan coming from its depths. The failing support beams were giving way. The wind howled outside, a furious, living thing. It wasn't my decision, Isaac yelled at Thorne over the growing noise, his voice raw with the agony of a memory he had buried for 5 years. Your wife. Eleanor was already too sick. The doctor said the medicine wouldn't have saved her. He made the choice, Silas, he chose to give the last dose to my Elizabeth, because there was still a chance for her, a chance she never got. Liar, Thorne shrieked, scrambling for his fallen pistol. It's the truth, Malene cried. She pulled a worn, leather-bound book from her satchel, not her mother's stolen journal, but something else she and Isaac had found during their search. It's all here. In the town doctor's journal, we found it in the county archives. She threw the book onto the floor between them. It fell open to a page dated 5 years prior, the entry written in a shaky hand. Gave the last of the quinine to Elizabeth Blackwood. A futile hope. Mrs. Thorne is too far gone. God help us all. Thorne stared at the open page, the lamplight illuminating the doctor's damning, exonerating words. The foundation of his 5-year crusade of hatred, the lie that had fueled his every action, crumbled to dust in an instant. His face, caught between the flickering light and encroaching shadows, collapsed. The rage was gone, replaced by a vast, empty despair. The mine gave another violent shudder, and the lanterns flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. The roar of the collapsing tunnel and the screaming wind are the only sounds left in the world. In the disorienting blackness, Isaac's voice cut through the roar. Malene, Jed, to me. Dust and grit filled the air, choking them. The groaning of stressed timbers was a constant, terrifying chorus. Isaac found Malene's hand, his grip a solid anchor in the chaos. He pulled her toward the side tunnel where Jed had been held. This way, it might lead out. Behind them, they heard a single broken sob from Silas Thorne, and the sound of a man utterly destroyed, not by a bullet, but by the truth. He made no move to follow. They stumbled through the suffocating darkness, Jed leading the way, by memory their only guide, the feel of the rock wall and the sloping floor. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, they saw a faint patch of lesser dark ahead. It was an old air shaft, choked with debris but passable. They clawed their way up toward the swirling, sand-choked twilight and burst out onto the side of the mesa just as a final deafening roars echoed from within. The main entrance of the North Star mine had collapsed completely, burying Silas Thorne and his ghosts forever. They huddled together against the rock, shielding their faces from the sandstorm's fury, gasping for breath. The storm raged around them, a physical manifestation of the violent emotions that had been unleashed in the mine. Justice had been served, but there was no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness. The sandstorm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnaturally quiet. A posse from Silver Creek, led by Isaac's deputy, found them at dawn, huddled and exhausted in the sheltered ravine with the horses. The story they told was simple and true. A kidnapping, a confrontation, a tragic mine collapse. The body of Silas Thorne was recovered 2 days later, along with those of his men. The stolen silver locket was found in his pocket. In the aftermath, the town of Silver Creek slowly began to heal. The fear that Thorne had cultivated dissipated, replaced by a communal sense of relief. Jed, bruised but otherwise unharmed, became a local hero, a status he endured with his usual grizzled stoicism. But for Malene and Isaac, the healing was a more private, more complicated process. The violence in the mine had stripped away all pretenses, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. A few nights after the collapse, Isaac came out to the ranch. He found Malene on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear, clean air. He didn't speak for a long time, simply stood beside her, sharing the silence. Finally, he turned to her, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. What Thorne said. About me choosing, he began, his voice rough. For 5 years, a part of me believed it too. I read the doctor's journal after it was all over. I knew the facts. But in my heart, I always felt the guilt. That maybe if I had argued, if I had demanded, maybe Elizabeth and Sarah. His voice broke. Malene turned and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. You are not guilty of anything but loving your family, Isaac. You did everything you could in a situation where there were no good choices. He looked at her, his blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The strong, stoic sheriff was gone, and in his place was a man finally allowing himself to grieve without the armor of guilt. When I saw that man holding a knife to Jed, and Thorne aiming his gun at me, all I could think about was you, about losing you. I was so afraid. I was afraid too, she whispered. But we faced it. Together. In that moment, their bond forged through shared danger, and the unearthing of painful truths solidified into something unbreakable. It was a connection built not on the easy soil of courtship, but on the bedrock of shared trauma and mutual respect. He leaned in, and this time his kiss was not the desperate, hurried press of their parting before the mine. It was slow and deep, and full of a profound, healing tenderness. It was the promise of a new beginning rising from the ashes of the past. Months passed. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant strokes of gold, and winter laid a brief, crystalline blanket of snow over the valley. With Thorne gone, a sense of peace settled over the double sea. Malene and Isaac, with Jed's indispensable help, worked to rebuild not just the fences and the barn, but their lives. The ranch began to thrive, a testament to their shared labor. The house was repaired, the garden planted, and the ghosts of the past were slowly replaced by the promise of a future. One crisp spring morning, as the first wildflowers pushed their way through the arid soil, Isaac found Malene by the newly built corral, watching a pair of newborn calves. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. I've been thinking, he said, his voice quiet and serious. A dangerous pastime for a sheriff, she teased gently. He smiled, but his eyes were earnest. He took her hand. Malene Cooper, you came to this town with nothing but a broken heart and a stubborn will. You've built a home, you've faced down danger, and you've shown more courage than anyone I've ever known. He took a deep breath. This ranch is your legacy from your mother, but I'm hoping you'll be willing to share it and your life with me. Marry me, Malene. Tears of joy welled in her eyes, blurring the bright morning. Her answer was a quiet, heartfelt yes. A week later, they rode to the small cemetery at the edge of town. Malene carried a small velvet-lined box. Inside were 2 silver lockets. One was the locket stolen from the bank, which had belonged to her aunt Eleanor Thorne. Isaac had retrieved it from the evidence locker, its legal purpose now served. The other was one she had found hidden in the rosewood box, with the photograph her mother's nearly identical to her sister's. Together they stood before the two simple graves of Elizabeth and Sarah Blackwood. Then they walked to an unmarked patch of ground, where by a strange frontier consensus, the townsfolk had buried Silas Thorne. There was no headstone. Malene opened the box. She took her mother's locket and Eleanor's and placed them side by side on the raw earth of Thorne's grave. It was an act of forgiveness, a mending of a broken family line, a final peace offering to the grief that had poisoned so many lives. As they turned to leave, the station master's boy came running toward them, waving an envelope. Sheriff A letter for Miss Cooper, all the way from Boston. Malene took it, her heart giving a surprised flutter. It was from her father. His handwriting was shaky, the words inside full of a remorse that felt for the first time genuine. He had heard of the events in Silver Creek, of her inheritance of the ranch. He offered no excuses for his past behavior, only a humble request for forgiveness and a tentative hope that he might one day meet the daughter he had so badly failed. Malene looked up from the letter at Isaac, at the strong, kind face of the man who was her future. She looked at the thriving town in the valley below her home. She was no longer the lost young woman, desperate for her father's approval. She was strong, she was loved, and she was free to make her own choices. She would write back in her own time. She would offer a cautious reconciliation. Isaac slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Malene leaned her head against his shoulder, a deep sense of peace settling over her. "I am home," she said.